This is Building Yammer Solutions in SharePoint and Yammer. I'm Neil McCarthy. I'm a product manager on the platform team at Yammer. And a little bit about myself, I was with Yammer for about a year and a half before the acquisition, which was this summer. And one of the things that I was the product manager for back then was our existing SharePoint web part. So yeah, SharePoint and all the Microsoft solutions have been on Yammer's radar for longer than just the last few months.
Hey, and I'm Mike Amerlon. I'm a program manager on the Yammer team as well. Formerly, I worked on SharePoint, so I worked on SharePoint for about 8 years, working on various developer technologies, solutions. I worked a good bit on the new SharePoint app model that you've probably got a good chance to see and explore for SharePoint 2013. And now I get to work with the Yammer folks, which is pretty cool because they have also a great platform with a lot of great things that you'll see today that are in a lot of ways very similar, and it's pretty exciting to be able to work with the Yammer folks on helping to build that out and helping them to integrate with SharePoint as well.
All right. Okay, so introductions out of the way. I'm going to make an assumption about the attendees here. I think most of you have customers with very specific needs, and one of the things that you like about SharePoint is that you can infinitely customize everything from the UI to the features to the way the data is stored. So Yammer has its own platform as well. So SharePoint sort of is a platform. I would say Yammer has a platform. Yammer's platform is going to be a little bit different than what you're used to with SharePoint. UI-wise, there's very little customization that's possible. Some of you probably have already noticed that. But we have a ton of open APIs. So the use case of the Yammer platform is more specific. It's to make Yammer a conversation layer across different apps. So because we have a more limited use case or a more specific use case than what SharePoint has, then that means we can kind of create APIs that are a little bit easier to use. So we'll see a lot of code today, and I think something that will strike you is how much simpler it is to get in and start doing things and really explore the breadth of the APIs on the Yammer side compared to SharePoint. So. Okay, so just quick agenda. We're going to talk about why and how, and then we're going to dive into a bunch of code samples. So, okay, the first is why. So why integrate with Yammer, especially if you're already integrated with SharePoint. There's some social features in there that you could take advantage of, and there's obviously, our use case for our platform is all social. So why integrate with the Yammer platform? And the big value add for you as app developers is to get discovered. We have millions of users using Yammer every day, and if you create a Yammer app and develop it kind of the right way and the recommended way, then you'll acquire some real estate in the Yammer user interface. So I mentioned that the Yammer user interface is not very customizable, but that doesn't mean that you can't put your content in there and that you can't get your app discovered in there. You definitely can. So in this screenshot, I have 4 examples of where your content can be surfaced. The top kind of highlighted box is universal search. On the right is the ticker, which has a hover card, and then the feed is in the middle. So this screenshot really highlights objects in Yammer that actually exist in other systems. So we'll get kind of down the rabbit hole of Open Graph a little bit later. But the idea is if you as app developers are keeping track of data or you have your own type of data in your system, you can tell Yammer about it, and then people can have conversations about it inside of Yammer and inside of your app. So that's kind of getting onto the next slide, which is adding a conversation layer. It's not the latest version, actually. So, okay, so you also may want to add social features to your app. And if you watch the keynote, there was some messaging there about different apps bolting on social features into their app, and then kind of reinforcing silos in different apps. So if you use Yammer as a conversation layer in your app, then people in different departments will be able to collaborate around your data. The idea, on this slide I'm showing a few examples of that. You can embed a sign in with Yammer button and learn about people who have already filled out their Yammer profile. They won't need to do something like upload an image in your site, and you won't need to ask them for their email address, because as soon as they sign in with Yammer, you get all that for free. And you can also embed Yammer-specific social actions in your apps, like follow and like. I'm sure you've seen Facebook like buttons have kind of proliferated through the consumer space on the web. And we offer the same type of embeddable like button in Yammer. When somebody likes something using the Yammer like button on your site, then Yammer is told that they like it, and when things happen to that app, to that piece of data in your app, then they get kind of notified in Yammer. They can have a social conversation about it, and you don't have to build these features. So that's a good benefit. And then activities. Really the richest way to integrate your app with Yammer is to build into it a feature where your app is telling Yammer what's happening, what users are doing, without them having to, explicitly share. So that is what we call an activity story. The stories themselves come into the ticker, which is kind of a small module on the top right, but you can send us a ton of data about each object, and then that makes your object searchable within Yammer, and users can use all the social features around that object without you having to build those yourself. Okay, so show of hands, who here has a Yammer account already? All right, most people, that's good. Okay, so before we get into the technical nitty-gritty of how to integrate with Yammer, for those of you who haven't used Yammer much or don't have an account yet, I'm going to do like a quick 5-minute overview of what Yammer actually is. It's a web app. Each company has their own network, so that's kind of like a site collection, and or kind of like a web app in SharePoint. And then each network has users. Some of them can be admins. And then there are a bunch of built-in Yammer objects. You've seen probably that we have notes in Yammer, and we have our own files in Yammer. But then there are also all these external objects that Yammer can find out about. So if somebody pastes a link into the Yammer message publisher, then our service on the back end will go try to scrape whatever data it can find about that object so that it can be described in a good way inside of Yammer. Okay, and just one note about admins. For those of you who haven't upgraded your Yammer network to premium, you don't have any admins, so that's one of the premium features is you get to have admins. So some of the things that you may want to develop, some of the endpoints that you may want to hit require a verified admin, which is the highest level of permission to hit. And if you don't want to pay for Yammer and you want to just kind of use Yammer to develop, then you can reach out to our partner team and they'll help you out with that. Okay, so big picture slide. I think I see this in every Yammer presentation that I watch, so I had to include it in mine. So what are we trying to do with this open graph idea and kind of putting it into the enterprise? So what we see in the enterprise space is a bunch of different apps designed for specific use cases that are being built by you and by others that allow users to collaborate within them. And they generally don't integrate with each other very well. So we see that a bunch, all the salespeople are collaborating in, Dynamics CRM, and all the marketing people are in some SharePoint team site, and the list goes on. So we see that the proliferation of apps throughout the enterprise has reinforced silos that exist between departments or org charts or what have you. So what we're trying to do is create a social layer that can go across all of them, and in order to do that, we need to build the enterprise graph, and we need you to help us do that. So the enterprise graph is our extension of Facebook's Open Graph protocol, specifically for the enterprise, and we're iterating on it rapidly like we do with all the components of Yammer. And what it allows you to do is describe data to us. So you can send us data a description of data that lives in your system via an activity story, or by embedding some JavaScript on a page. Once the user loads it, it tells us about the Open Graph object, or it creates an Open Graph object in Yammer that represents that object in your system. And then really what we want to own is the conversation, and we want you to own all the, the stuff that you're good at, like workflow or other business-specific or use case-specific features that we'll just never get around to putting inside Yammer. So, moving on. All right. So, okay, the first kind of side of the coin that I can go over here, or that Mike's going to go over in code, is Yammer embed. So, let's say that you want to put Yammer social features inside of your app. So you have some pages that represent objects. You have some other pages that are collaboration spaces. You want to add the conversation layer that Yammer provides into your app. So you do that with Yammer Embed. First, a user can sign in with Yammer, even if they're already signed into your app, and your app can get all that useful profile information. And also, now the Yammer Embed widgets that are all over your pages know who that user is in Yammer. So if they post inside of your inside of your app, then the conversation is started both in your app and in Yammer. So you can also embed follow and like buttons, like I mentioned, and also a feed. So that's really, one of the biggest features of Yammer is just the fact that it has a feed. It has a lot of different types of feed. It has feeds for groups and individual users, and it has feeds for objects as well, objects that live in third-party systems. So that's kind of what I'm showing here. Somebody went to a page in this app called Skidoo, and Skidoo has a Yammer Embed feed on it. And as soon as they loaded that page, the Yammer Embed feed told Yammer about the object. Like, if you don't know that this event already exists in my system, then instantiate it. And then it kept track of what the user was doing, and then sent periodic, actually real-time activity stories to Yammer, so that somebody in Yammer who's not in Skidoo yet can discover Skidoo. Somebody in Yammer who doesn't have permission to view the actual stuff in Skidoo can still have a conversation around it. So it's kind of allowing you to manage things like privacy, and then giving you all these social features so you don't have to build them. Okay, so developing. One thing that Mike is going to show is just a quick process that you need to go through to get started. So you don't need a premium Yammer account or admin status to create an app. When you create an app, you'll just register it on the site. Then you automatically have a consumer key for an app that any user in your network can use. And then finally, if you want to, you can, so Yammer has an app directory that we just launched about a month ago, maybe a little less. You can list your app in your company's app directory for, with no approval required by us. So.
All right. So with that, I'm going to get started on developing our first Yammer app. And so hopefully one of the takeaways that you'll have, if you want to switch over to the number 6, one of the takeaways that you'll come away from is that actually getting started and working with Yammer is really super simple. And in fact, hopefully through the span of this presentation, you'll actually see the entire breadth of the kinds of things that you can do to develop on top of Yammer. And I'll also have an emphasis on integrating with SharePoint and integrating with Office. So what I've done is I've started with Visual Studio, and I've created a very basic ASP.NET project here. So this is just a standard ASP.NET web forms. I'm just choosing it because that's kind of one of the simpler things, of course. Yammer is exposed as a set of protocols, it's a set of services, and so really you can use any developer technology, whether it's ASP.NET MVC or Rails or what have you, to interact with Yammer, but I'm just sticking with ASP.NET Web Forms. But the first part of actually developing a Yammer solution is to go to Yammer. So this is my Yammer test network, Contoso Foods, but as Neil mentioned, you might want to create your own network for doing your own types of development or create an external network in one of your existing company networks. Now, to actually get started with developing on Yammer, the first thing to do is go to developer.yammer.com. Now, two things. One is that, of course, this has all the documentation and the content about how you actually develop, the REST APIs, Open Graph, working with that. But there's also a tool here that you'll want to use. Up at the right hand, you'll see create an app link. And so what create an app link will do is it will take me back to my contosofoods.com Yammer network. Think of it in the same way as you would think of a SharePoint site collection or an Office 365 tenancy. This is my company's space. And what I can do from here is actually go and create a new application. Now, if you're familiar with SharePoint 2013 development, this may look familiar to you. There's actually a page in SharePoint 2013 called App Reg New that actually does the exact same thing, which is allows you to create an app, declare some of the basic properties about it, and from there you actually get a client ID and a client secret that you can embed inside of your application. So in this case, I'm just going to call this hello SPCA, and I'm just going to fill out some basic properties. Enter my email. I'll diligently read the terms of service and abide by them, basically saying please don't crush Yammer and all kinds of other good fun things you can read about. So that's the basic start of it. You can see that there's a 5-step flow here, and actually Neil will go into that a little bit later towards the end of the back half of this flow. But you can see I already have a client ID and secret. But to really complete this registration, what I need to do is enter in the website that I'm going to be developing against, the redirect information, and then click Save. So over here I have my ASP.NET project, and I can see that it's going to deploy to localhost 8711. So I'm just going to use that as the website. So localhost 8711, like so. And there's a support URL, terms of service. I'll also enter in a redirect URI. It says it's optional, but really you probably need to specify one. I've seen that it doesn't work so well if you don't have that specified. And redirect URI is one of the things that we use to verify that your app is actually coming from its intended location. And so now I'm just going to click Save Changes. And so now my app is ready to go, and I have my client ID and my secret, and I've registered enough information to make this app work. So I'm going to come back to my ASP.NET application, and I'm going to add a new page. Now, what I'm going to do here is actually use one of those Yammer embeds that Neil mentioned. And basically what this is a very simple JavaScript embed. So there's not actually even any server-side code needed. So I could actually make this an HTML page. Oops, I missed. I don't want to add a reference. I'll just go add a new item. And I'm just going to choose a simple web form page. Call it webform1.aspx. And over here, I'll just go grab some code that I'm going to actually copy into this page, and we'll go walk through it. So, replace all this content with what I've just pasted in. Okay. So there's really two important parts to this particular snippet. There's standard web page stuff, but at the top you can basically see that I have a script link, which is linked over to a page, a JavaScript file on Yammer called yam.js, affectionately known as yamjuice. And that basically contains all of the logic that's needed to make the Yammer application run. It'll do things like pull in basically some framework libraries. I think it pulls in jQuery, right? So it'll pull in that kind of infrastructure in order to make Yammer itself work. Now, there's also a part here called data app ID, and this is where I can actually specify the application ID that I just created so that Yammer knows that this is the application that I'm working on. So I'll just go select this and copy it and paste this back in here. So now Yammer knows exactly which application this is in regards to. And so really what I have here is a very simple JavaScript function called yam.connect.embedFeed. And this takes a couple of properties. One is the location of an element on the page to go embed this into. So this is standard CSS selectors you could specify to choose where to target it. And then, by the way, I have to say which network am I embedding this for. So in this case, my company is contosofoods.onmicrosoft.com, and that's where I'll be working from. Okay, so let's go try this out. And run this in Internet Explorer. And so the first time that happens, is what you'll see is a sign-in button. So underpinning all of this is OAuth, whether you're using JavaScript on the client, whether you're using it on the server. There's an OAuth flow for authorizing your application's use of these APIs in the context of a particular user. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail about this later, but suffice to say, for now, what you'll see is a standard flow of OAuth authentication. So in this case, I see a standard Yammer sign-in button. So I'll click this. And I'll get an OAuth dialog, which will say, hey, this new application, hello SPCA, do you want to allow it to access your Yammer Contoso Foods network? I'll click allow. And now my application is authorized. And so now when I come back to this page, what you see is a very basic embed already in the page. And what this is doing is it's pulling in basically the all messages feed from Yammer and putting it into my page. And so this is just a very simple example of getting an embed into my SharePoint page. Of course, it could be any web page anywhere. And really, all we did was three things. Registered an app, added that script tag, and added the Yammer embed call. And Yammer handled all the rest. So that's a really fundamental, just a very basic case of embedding Yammer into an application. Well, now I'm going to go switch and go a little bit further and show you some other usages of Yammer. So I'm going to go switch to a SharePoint application called Document Discussions. And so when Neil was talking about different types of data sources that you might have in your company and types of objects that you might want to expose in Yammer, well, one of them is SharePoint. SharePoint has a ton of different objects, documents, tasks, pictures, to-dos, all kinds of things that might be interesting to have a conversation on inside of Yammer. Now, in the long term, you might imagine that documents from SharePoint will probably have some pretty darn good integration in Yammer. So I'm not suggesting that you need to go build an add-in to get document integration inside of Yammer. That will be coming over time and that kind of thing. But what I've done here in this demo is what I wanted to do was integrate documents as they worked inside of SharePoint and allowed you to have discussions on them inside of Yammer. So this is a standard SharePoint 2013 application. And so like a lot of applications, there's basically two parts to it. There's the actual website, which is called Document Discussions Web, and this is an ASP.NET project. I'm actually hosting it on an Azure website so that it can actually be accessed in the cloud, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But I have a number of different pages here, and I have some event receivers and that kind of thing, and I have my SharePoint app declaration. So my SharePoint app declaration makes this an app, and it says, here's a couple of things that are actually inside of Yammer. One is that when this app launches, go to this page over here. And when people actually access documents inside of Yammer on the Yammer menu, go to a separate page called postdocumentstory.aspx. So let's go just take a look at what this actually looks like, and then we'll take a look at the code. But when you actually see what the code looks like, it won't be too different from what I just showed you, in that it's very simply just embedding the Yammer discussion component in various different contexts and with different metadata so that you can target the discussion that's being had. So this is loading the page. It goes to SharePoint. SharePoint redirects from the SharePoint site over into my application, and it provides a bunch of metadata about what site is this being launched in the context of, what's the user identifier. It's got a SharePoint OAuth token, so I can actually call back into SharePoint and do more with it, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well later. But for now, you can basically see this is a web page where I've got document discussions. And I can say, this is a swell demo, like this, and click Update. Now, there's a little bit of an issue here. It might be a bug, but you get that sort of, are you sure you want to stay on the page? But that will get fixed. But anyway, what I've done here is I've actually embedded a new comment for this document into the page. Now, what I've done here in particular is target this to a particular Open Graph entity. So one of the things I wanted to do was have a way to discuss on the SharePoint site in general and have discussions that are focused for this particular team on their site. And so what I'm doing is I'm actually taking the team site URL here, contosofoods.sharepoint.com/site/dev, and using that as my Open Graph identifier so that conversations that we have in the context of the site get sort of organized through that Open Graph ID. And of course, we'll talk a little bit more about Open Graph, but you can essentially see this is where conversations are happening. Of course, a lot of the big reason behind this is that now my conversations are also shared inside of Yammer. So if I need help or if people are wondering what's going on, they can see it inside of Yammer. I can say, I can reply to this and I can say, hey, @Neil, like that. And we can continue our conversation about this site in Yammer. And when Neil comes along later, you can actually see this Open Graph entity. So you can see fairly quickly that by embedding Yammer in your application in various forms, you get a sense of virality that you can spread throughout it. Now, taking a look at the code for this, it's not too shocking if you saw the previous code snippet. So if I just go to, let's see, default.aspx, the code looks pretty much the same. What I'm doing here is I'm using the standard SharePoint app Chrome control so that I get the standard look and feel of SharePoint across the top, which is a JavaScript control that is part of the standard SharePoint app framework. So that's, if you have more questions on that, we can sort of talk about that later, but this just gives me the standard look and feel. And then what I do down here is I take the URLs that SharePoint gives me about what's the site that I'm being accessed in the context of. And what I do here is I use that to express the Open Graph URL that we're going to be having this conversation on. So this means that when I go and embed the component, what you'll see is that it's done in the context of that Open Graph URL. So that's how I make it specific to a particular topic. And of course, you can use other URLs like documents, as we'll see later. Now, one other just related integration is when I go back to my site, I also want to work with documents. The whole point of this app is to be a doc discussions app. So the other thing I've integrated with is the SharePoint drop-down menu. So what this allows me to do is have a jump-off point in the main SharePoint document libraries and item libraries, and of course you can do other types of things as well. And so there's this contact form image that maybe I want to go discuss with other people. And now I've added an item called Discuss on Yammer. And so, okay, we'll just keep going. So what this should do is actually give me a discussion that is sort of targeted to this particular document. Let me just try that one more time. So in this case, what I'm going to be doing is it's pretty much the exact same code as before, where I'm essentially, why am I going to the My Site? Wow. Where it's the same document as before, the same type of snippet as before, but rather than targeting it to the entire site, I'm actually using the Open Graph URL of the actual file as the way to organize this conversation. Let me just try this one more time. Oh. This is happening in the sort of the SharePoint user interface layer, so let's see. Okay. Okay, there we go. So I can have a discussion about this particular document. I can say, okay, contact form looks great. Click update. Again, this bug, but otherwise you can have now this discussion about this particular URL for the contact form. And so you can have just different types of discussions hosted everywhere. So one final integration I want to show for Open Graph is through these embeds is inside of Excel. So let me just go show you what this looks like. So of course, Office also has a model where you can actually integrate web pages inside of Office. And so what you can see here is Excel, and what I've done is I've actually embedded Yammer inside of Office. Now, when it's the same kind of concept, I want to embed Yammer components so that we can have a discussion about this file. But since a lot of files actually don't live on the internet, you can't have a discussion about them because Open Graph needs a URL in order to identify where the discussion is going to be had. And you don't want those URLs to be c:/documents and settings my documents because that won't make sense in the broader context. And so in order for me to actually have an Open Graph conversation about a document, to do that, I have to open up a web document or save my document to the internet. And then from there, you'll get, as you might expect, a very similar experience as well, where I can actually have the conversation inside of Office, and I'll get the Yammer embed component embedded on the right-hand side. But of course, the Office platform for actually being able to embed documents and embed other types of web pages inside of your documents, as you think about all the different types of extensions we'll show you a little bit later in this presentation, think about how you could actually integrate them in the Office applications as well, because there's a lot of opportunities now that you can actually embed web pages inside of Office like that. Okay, so that's just a very brief overview of embeds and actually getting started with building Yammer apps in a very brief nutshell.
All right. Thanks, Mike. So before we get on to REST APIs, I just want to kind of reiterate some of the things that Mike said. And so that was embed. Yammer embed as a technology, Open Graph as the piece of the platform that Mike integrated with. And there's a lot of hidden power in those widgets, despite their kind of how easy they are to set up and how comparatively few configuration and customization options are built into them compared to, say, SharePoint. You have real-time messaging now, replies, likes, threaded conversations, rendering document and video previews directly inside of that feed, attaching and uploading files. So we're trying to give you a lot of functionality, make it simple, and make it not too customizable so that the user experience is fairly similar across your app, the conversations that they have in your app, and also then the conversations that they have about your app's data inside of Yammer.com. Okay, so that was embed. We talked about Open Graph a lot, but we do have REST APIs. They're also very powerful, so we can So you as a developer can use your key to do things like programmatically get all the messages from a certain user, all the groups that a certain user belongs to, the information of users, other users in the network, suggestions. So we keep a ranking of objects in Yammer for each user. So if you want to find the top 3 relevant documents to a user that Yammer knows about, then you can ask Yammer for that information. Autocomplete is a great endpoint that I used recently in a sample app. Yammer has real-time type-ahead search, so you can implement that in your interface, and then users can basically search through the Yammer directory without going to Yammer, so they can find people to connect to, people to share things with in your app. Then search and finding different networks are a couple of other ones. So I marked be careful next to the messages endpoint. So why did I do that? So the messages endpoint is very powerful. As you would expect, it allows you to get all the messages and also post messages on behalf of users. And after the user clicks the allow button, there's nothing stopping you from, as an app developer, sending way too many messages to their feed. So going back to the screenshot that I showed earlier, I showed system-generated stuff and objects that exist in other systems coming in and kind of being segmented inside the Yammer UI into an activity stream, which I've been calling the ticker. We want those to stay there, and we want to do stuff with that data. Right now, it looks like you're not really getting that much real estate if you're sending the activity stories. And I know I've talked to some developers that are tempted to just post automatically to the message feed on behalf of users every time a user does something in their system. So we strongly urge that you don't do that. Because users expect to see user-generated content in the feed. We saw that in the Zynga Facebook integration, the first version of that. We all got a million requests to do stuff in, like, help somebody grow radishes or something like that. I never even played, so I don't even know, but I got the messages, and I'm sure it was very viral and good for Zynga, but it was bad for Facebook's user experience, so they clamped down on that, and then they invented Open Graph, and that's kind of how the evolution of this got started. So another thing to be careful of is if you're going to put a Yammer feed in your app, you should use embed and not just consume the messages API and then surface it your own way, because that's not a consistent user experience, and you don't get all those features like real time and like rendering previews in the feed for free. So, okay. So next we're going to talk about the most exciting part, which is authenticating with OAuth.
Okay.
So here, why don't you take the clicker?
Sure. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the underlying technology that all of these types of extensions Yammer has are done through OAuth in terms of identifying that it's coming from your app. And when you use the embeds and when you use JavaScript, Yammer's really simplified it. So all you do is you call connect, for example, or login or embed, and other than providing a callback, at which point you'll get called later on, Yammer handles all the OAuth flow, so it's actually abstracted from you. But as good technical people, and when you want to work on the server, you need to understand a little bit about how the flow works. And we'll see a little bit of how that's implemented in a sample application. But this is probably very similar to a lot of OAuth flows you've seen. It starts with three clients, 3 tiers, if you will. There's the user in their browser. There's the application, which is on a third-party server, let's say Azure or something like that. And then there's Yammer, which is actually the place which has all the data that we're interested in. So let's say the user goes and visits your application. So they go to mycooldocumentapp.com, and you want to do something for that user inside of Yammer. Well, the first thing that happens is that the myCoolDocument app says, hey, you know what? You actually don't have a registered Yammer authentication token that's good. And so in order for me to go get one, I have to ask your browser to go over to yammer.com and do the authentication dialog that we just saw to get permissions and to make sure it's OK for my application to work. And when the user clicks OK on the button on the dialog to say, yes, it's OK for mycooldocuments.com to access my Yammer feed, Yammer will redirect the browser back to my web page on mycooldocuments.com. What it'll do is it'll contain a code. The code is just a randomly generated code that's sort of specific to my particular application. And when I get that code on my server side, I can take that code and I can go say, hey, Yammer, here's my client secret, here's the code. Can you make sure that this is validated and legitimate, that I'm not getting hacked in some way or spoofed by the client browser? And Yammer will say, yes, that's valid, it's good. It's OK, it's legitimate. And so now what I have is an OAuth token. And with that OAuth token, what I can now do is make server-side REST calls against Yammer to do things like call messages, hopefully not to add too many messages to the feed, or to do get the set of groups or users or that kind of thing. And so then my server does some thinking, and of course it returns a web page back to the user, like so. So this is a standard OAuth flow. Keep it in the back of your head. And we'll show you a little bit of how that's implemented when we get to actually talking about server-side code and how that works. But first, what I'll do is I want to take you through to like a simple JavaScript call where we're actually going to go work with JavaScript APIs. So if you want to switch. OK, so now we're going to go back to our Hello World. We're going to go back to our Hello World project, which we just created from scratch, as you'll recall. Or actually, we created this one from scratch. OK, so now we're going to add another page to this. And what we're going to do in this page is we're actually going to make a REST API call against Yammer inside of JavaScript. And like the last application, this is all 100% JavaScript. In this case, there's no server-side code. And so you can really easily and richly make full REST calls just using JavaScript, using whatever type of web server hosting or platform of your choice. So let me go to my handy-dandy notepad and just grab another snippet. And we'll talk through the lines of code again one more time. OK. So now I'm going to paste that in. OK, so again, at the top, there's this registration for assets.yammer.com for YamJuice. And so what I'll do there is I will go back to my I have to go back to my Yammer site, and I have to go back to my created apps link. I can see all the apps that I, as a developer, have created. And I'm going to go back to hello SPCA. And here I can find my client ID. So this is what I'm going to use to authenticate my application back over to Yammer. Paste that in. Make sure there's no trailing spaces. Sometimes the website will add a trailing space, and so you'll copy the space in. And of course, then it won't work, and you'll get all kinds of, hey, your code's not valid, and you'll scratch your head, and then you'll realize you had a trailing space. So keep an eye out for that, and we'll look to see if we can't fix that. But so what you'll see here is that this is just a very simple page, and let me go run it so you can see what it actually does and what it looks like. So this is just a very simple Yammer message poster. So it's as simple as it gets. It's kind of the hello world of doing things in Yammer. So I can say, hello, SPC. Now it says, welcome to Yammer, which is, it said, welcome to Yammer. That got inserted a little bit later on. And I can say, hello, SPC, and click post. And now if I go back to my Yammer feed, what you'll see is that hello, SPC will be posted inside of here. So this is just a very simple example. Let's take a look. So what you can see is the first thing I do is I just say log in. And so I've made this code even a little bit more wordy than it needs to be because I'm calling a function to do that. But this will just go embed a login button. And again, Yammer will do all the work to handle the OAuth process. Now, if I actually hadn't accepted this application in the first demo that I did, what you would see there is you'd see it would pop out a browser and say, do you want to allow this application to continue? And I would click OK. But since I've already given this application permission, it just very smoothly and seamlessly did all the flow. And when the actual response came in, it's inserted the HTML welcome to Yammer. So that was my indication that the login process has succeeded, and it's embedded some content inside of the page. OK, and now when I actually want to go post, I'm just going to go call the Yammer REST API. Now, the REST API that they have, it's RESTy, so it's very object-oriented in terms of the URL structure and how you do things. So if I want to go create a new message, I do a post against a particular URL. The other part of it is that it's all JSON-based. So if you want to read things off of it, you'll get JSON object structures back from it. And if you want to post new things, you just want to post in a JSON form to it. So in this case, it's just very simple. I'm just going to go structure a very simple message object with a body. And I'm going to pass in the value of my text box. I'm going to call this endpoint, which is documented on developer.yammer.com. And then it will go launch this. It'll go fire off this request. This function here is called yam.request. So it wraps the jQuery XHR XML HTTP request object so they can make web requests. And so that's the technology it uses. So some of the things that you might be familiar with for customizing that in jQuery, they also accrue to yam.request. But in this case, all I had to do was specify my method, that it's JSON, that it's got this particular body, and away I go with my very simple JavaScript-based request. So that's all the client-side flow. Now let's take a look at the server-side flow for how you do this. Now you'll have to recall back that slide I showed you a little bit earlier about the flow for how you go and do these things. So let me go stop this and go to my other project where I've already coded this guy. So in this case, I've got a page which is going to do the same thing, except for it's going to do it on the server. So it's going to basically post a message to Yammer using just server-side code rather than using client-side JavaScript. Now, this is way more difficult than just using JavaScript, so probably as a developer, you want to use the previous approach. But in order to show the basic concepts, I have the same equivalent on the server as well. OK, so what this actually does is it actually lists all of the various messages in here. One of them actually has a bunch of HTML because I did an at mention, so that came in kind of more complicated. But I can say hello from server, like this. Click post. And this will go post it. And so this is my list of messages from Yammer. It's not the world's most attractive UI by any sense. And you can see, of course, in Yammer, it already shows up there as well. So now, the way I implemented this was actually as an ASP.NET web form. I know that not the most modern or sort of maybe sexy technologies for doing it, but just to show you, so I have, let's see, message poster.cs. And so this is just an ASP.NET control, and I embed some very simple controls for a text box and a button. And when I did this, I built a very simple object, a very simple function that what it does is the same thing on the server. It basically structures a cross-domain request, and it'll go send it over the server. But the interesting part of this is actually the OAuth flow, which happens beforehand. And for that, I have a function called Yammer Web Form Context. OK, so here's where the tire hits the pavement in terms of how this actually works. So the first question that my application has to ask is, do you have a valid authentication token? Now, what that means is that my server actually has to do some work to store an authentication token on behalf of users, so that if users hit the page, 10 minutes later, 20 minutes later, they don't have to go through this entire flow. By making an auth token and storing it on the server through like a SQL database or something like that, users can have a pretty good experience where most of the time they already have an authenticated token. Yammer's auth tokens don't expire, although a user can actually go into the Yammer UI and revoke a token. So in general, the assumption of let's cache a token is a good one, although you'll have to be prepared for what happens if somebody revokes access to your application. Now, if they don't have an auth token, the first thing I do is I say, hey, has Yammer actually handed us a code? So when I first go to redirect the user's browser to Yammer, and the user says, OK with the application, it's going to put a code at the top of the page in the URL params. Now, if they don't have the code yet, if we're sort of in stage one of this authentication token flow, what I'll basically do is redirect the user, redirect the user's browser to a URL that Yammer has for handling OAuth. So that's this guy. That's yammer.com/dialog/OAuth. And so that's the first phase. Now, when the user comes back and they have their auth code, what I basically do there is I build an HTTP web request. And what I can do is then I can go call their validator URL. I can pass in my client ID and my client secret along with that code that I got from Yammer. And if the code validates, because it's a legitimate code that was received from the user that came from Yammer, I'll get a response back. And the response will give me an OAuth token that I can use for future requests, that I can basically just put onto any future web request that I make as either a header or as a URL param. And from there, now I can make all the kinds of REST calls that I need to on the server. So that's a really fundamental, basic building block for how you do this. Now, for all this code, by the way, I'll be making it available after the session. I do need to do a little bit of cleanup, but I'll make it available this weekend, and we'll get instructions at the end on how you can actually get at this code. So this is just some standard .NET code about that automates a little bit of this process, and I'll make it available so you can get at it. Although, really, if you actually read the website and you read how it works, it took me about maybe 2 hours to implement the flow, because it really is that simple of redirect, take the code, validate it against Yammer. Now you've got an OAuth token. Now you can do all the REST APIs you want. So that's just a very simple example of just working with the REST APIs and with OAuth on the server, and how you can do things with that. Okay.
All right. Thanks, Mike. So we talked about easily getting started with Yammer embed, and then we talked about getting a little bit more power by implementing a server-side OAuth flow, caching a token, and then using it to hit the REST API. And now, really the deepest that we can go is what we're going to talk about next, and that's activity stories. So Open Graph is a data-level integration. It's very rich. You can send us lots of attributes, previews, whatever you want, to describe the objects that exist in your system. And the best way to create a rich feeling experience inside of Yammer around your objects is by sending us activity stories. Activity stories tell us what the object is, allow you to most fully describe the objects, and also you're telling us everything that's happening to the objects when users do them. So users can really get a sense of, of work getting done in your system without having to go to your system first to explore and figure out, what people are working on. So an activity story is made up of 3 components: an actor, an action, and an object. It shows up in Yammer like Neil McCarthy updated product roadmap.docx, and within that product roadmap.docx object that your app sends to Yammer, you describe that this is a document, here's a preview of it, here's who you want the activity story delivered to, here's an image that your app is your app's logo, so the user knows that this is a Word doc that's in your app, so they can discover content, not just the existence of your app. And to get a little bit more detailed, a user acts on the object in the system. You describe that activity to us by sending us a JSON blob that Mike's going to go over the syntax for in a moment. We receive that activity story. If the object that was acted upon is not in our system yet, we'll instantiate a new Open Graph object inside of Yammer. That Open Graph object will come with its own page inside of Yammer dedicated to things and conversations that are happening around that object. People can then follow that Open Graph object, so when stuff happens to the object in your system, they can be aware of that in Yammer. And it has a little ticker of just the things that have happened to that object. It has its own feed, and yeah, like I mentioned, the Yammer followers. So you get all that for free. Also, it shows up in our universal search. So if a user is trying to figure out, they know an object exists in your system, maybe you don't have a built-in search, or maybe a user just wants to have a conversation around it in Yammer, they can instantly do the type ahead search, and it will autocomplete with the name of the object that you've sent to us. So we deliver the activity story, and we can deliver it publicly. So if you send us an activity story about a new blog post being created in your system, then you would probably want that to be public. So that'll be delivered to the user who acted upon it and all of their followers within Yammer. And then people can freely follow that object, comment on it, not have to worry about any kind of permission settings on the Yammer side. Conversely, if you have a private object, like maybe someone's expense report, and you want a limited group of people who you know about in your system to be able to collaborate on that in Yammer, we can also support that. You send us in the envelope that you use the JSON envelope that you use to send the activity story to us, you can specify that this is a private activity story and it should only be delivered to the actor and X number of users that you specify by email address. So then only they'll see it. Only those users will be able to go to the Open Graph object page. Only those users will be able to search for that object. And nowhere in the UI will other users ever get access to even the description of the object that you're sending to us, much less us subverting your permissions in a deeper way. So then finally we surface the activity story and all that stuff that I mentioned in our UI. It's all designed to be real time. So when you send an activity story, I think actually that's not quite real time. It's like within 5 or 10 seconds, you'll see the activity story tick down inside of the ticker, and then after that your object is indexed and people can have a conversation about it.
Yeah, it's only during keynote demos when it takes unnaturally longer than
it
needs to. Anyway, so that's a snippet of actually the data structure, the JSON data structure for expressing an activity story, and we'll take a look a little bit at that in detail. But again, that's just a standard JSON blob. You can use whatever tool that you use to construct them to go build them. So let me show you just a very simple hello world. We'll start off with that. So I'm going to go back to my web page. So I will go to activity.aspx. And so here what you can see is sort of the basic metadata that I need to go create an activity story inside of Yammer. So it all starts with a URL. Everything is identified by its URL. You have to have one. Now, to be honest, it doesn't need to be a real URL. It can be sort of a virtual URL, but typically this is going to be the thing that people click on to go see more information about it. So you do probably want to make sure it's real, but yeah, good idea. So I'm just going to go point at a document, foo.docx. Now, OpenGraph has a concept of types, so it's kind of a schema system. In Yammer, they do things like aggregate the various posts that happen for it based on the actual type, so I'm going to give this a type of document. I'll just give it a fake image for now. Contoso, sharepoint.com/foo.gif. I'm going to call this, a great document. The other necessary part of OpenGraph activity updates is that you have to have an actor or a person who's doing it. And here, the primary key, if you will, of this is an email address that you want to use to sort of identify who's the person who did this. Now, a couple of tips here. One is that when I post an activity story, people will only be able to see it if it's something that I posted or if it's something that people follow. And so one of the things that I always sort of stub my toe on as a developer, I'll type some quasi-bogus email address, and then I won't see it in Yammer because that email address is not me and it's not a person I'm following, so it doesn't show up in my activity stream. So you got to make sure that it's a legitimate email address as far as the Yammer site is concerned. And of course, I put that in the wrong field, so let me go put that into email. I'll give myself a name. There's also a set of canned actions that you can supply for these Open Graph activity updates, although on the Yammer site, you'll see the standard ones, things like update. But you can also, we'll be able to create custom action types as well. So if you've got an opportunity in a CRM system, you can do things like close it or reopen it or update a contact or that kind of thing for it. So I'm just going to go post this over to the server. Okay, so hopefully what will happen is that now it should show up inside of my activity stream, we'll hope. Just go refresh it just to make sure that we're getting the freshest of the fresh. Make sure I don't have any typos. Oh yeah, so there we go. So now I have this activity post for this particular document inside of Yammer. I can do things like search and find it. And of course, if I had specified a better image, this would be real, and you can see more information about it. So that's the very basics of actually getting a post over into Yammer. Okay, well, that's all well and good. Now, what I did when I actually implemented this was I used the JSON serialization infrastructure that comes with .NET 4.5 to actually, streamline the process of creating those JSON blobs. Now, ultimately, what Neil showed you is, about 10 different fields maybe all told. So constructing it as a string is also not heavily complicated. But here, I use the .NET 4.5 data contract serializers to serialize this in a way that I could access it through .NET. So basically, there's as you saw, there's sort of an actor object, which is sort of the main thing that did this action, and there's an Open Graph object, which describes the properties of the thing that I'm talking about inside of Yammer. So I can go to that, and you'll see the structure for that one. And it's got a URL, a type, an image, a title, basically what you saw on that form that I showed you earlier. Now, the other thing you can do inside of Yammer is when you post an activity story, you can also limit it from a security perspective to a set of known email addresses. So if you only want a smaller set of folks to actually be able to see the activity update, there's sort of the fundamental tools of a security system in there as well, so you can supply that in addition for your Open Graph update. So that's a very basic sample of doing an activity update, but we want to do something a bit more complex, which is now I'm going to go over to my SharePoint site, and I've got a document library here. And what I really want to do is when people upload or activate documents inside of their SharePoint site, you want to see that inside a Yammer feed. You would think that this would probably be common behavior. It works for the SharePoint feeds, for example. And so, obviously over time, this is probably something we'll be looking to do, but just to show you the fundamental concept of Open Graph, I want to show you the very basic concept of what I can do is I can upload a file. So standard SharePoint upload process. And what I'll do here is I'll just upload a PDF file, like so. Okay, so now this has uploaded that document into SharePoint. And what I really want that to do is trigger an update inside of Yammer. And so that should come across. We'll see if it comes across. Now, the way I made this work is through a SharePoint app. So SharePoint apps, as you probably know, are basically sort of typically remote websites, or they can be hosted on SharePoint. And rather than sort of some of the older solutions and the way that they actually integrated inside of SharePoint, what happens instead is that a SharePoint app, what a SharePoint app will do is it sort of runs on its own server, and it'll use REST APIs, it'll use OAuth, and it'll get various integration points in with SharePoint that allows it to go do sort of integrations. So in fact, the model is very close to the way Yammer works. Hasn't updated yet? Oh, bummer. Let's see. There we go. See, we got that activity story for that document that I just uploaded. It just took longer than 5 seconds, again, only during demos.
Right.
Right. So SharePoint has its own app model. So now one of the features that SharePoint exposes is something called remote event receivers, which is anytime something happens to a document library, what it'll do is it'll fire an external web service. And so that's the backbone of how this is actually implemented. When I upload a document into SharePoint, it'll fire that remote event service. I've got a service that's hosted on Azure that intercepts that and basically gets the metadata that says, oh, by the way, a document was updated. I then go call back into SharePoint and say, hey, SharePoint, tell me more about this user, tell me more about this document. And then I convert that into a Yammer post. So that's kind of a bit tricky. The other thing that's tricky about this is I have all these OAuth tokens, but I need to use these OAuth tokens when I'm actually running inside of a web service. And so what that also means is that I need to take those OAuth tokens that I collected and I authenticated earlier, I need to cache them into a backing SQL server so that later on, when the event receiver actually fires, I have an OAuth token I can use to call back into Yammer and go do an activity story using that token. So I'm just going to show you some of the fundamental backbones behind that and what that looks like. So if I go over to, so let's just go start with the actual event receiver itself. So as you know, I have sort of this event receiver that's registered, but the interesting thing about the way SharePoint works is that you want event receivers on the parent site. So when you add an application, you add it in the context of a SharePoint site. And so when I want to have those event receivers that trap document updates, I want to register them on the parent site. Now, that's actually not a very easy thing to do inside of SharePoint. You actually have to use code to go do it. And in my case, what I did was I actually added some JavaScript into my default page that starts when the actual app boots up. Let's go find that. And what this does is it actually calls some SharePoint CSOM, some client object model, to go register those event receivers back inside of SharePoint. So the first time you actually hit my page when you first run the application, what it's doing behind the scenes is actually registering these events that will go call Yammer and let it know about activity updates. So it's basically calling a URL that's hosted on my Azure Web Service and saying anytime an item's updated or added through standard CSOM, it'll actually go and call my web service. Now, in terms of how my web service is implemented, if you know anything about remote event receivers inside of SharePoint, the way it has to be implemented is as a SOAP web service. And there's two methods that get called. One's called process one-way event, and one's called process event. Now, process one-way event happens for after asynchronous events, ones that are happening after the actual action has happened, which in the case of doing a Yammer activity story, it doesn't need to be super quick. So we can leverage these sort of after asynchronous events. So the first thing I do is I call Yammer standalone context. This is an object I built. And the main thing that it does is it'll actually call into a SQL database that's hosted on Azure, and it will go say, hey, for this particular URL, do I actually have an OAuth token for Yammer? Because I'm going to need that to go post the activity story. Now, one thing this sample doesn't do is a very good job of user management, which is where it can get tricky. So for example, if Neil updates a document, the way this code sample works is we'll end up using Mike's OAuth token to go do it, which is probably not a great idea. So you'd want to have a little bit more of a sophisticated scheme for managing OAuth tokens. In any case, what I'll do here is I'll actually call back into SharePoint using the client object model that's exposed for SharePoint and go get more information about the user, the web, the list, and the list item. Because I need these to fill out the right properties for my Yammer update. For example, in the actual post to the event receiver, SharePoint will let you know here's the identity of the user who performed this action, which is close, but in order to post an Open Graph activity, I actually need their email address. So I have to call back into SharePoint and say, here's their ID, go give me an email address for that user. So it's a little bit cumbersome, but you have to go do it. Okay, so through ClientOM, I go retrieve all these properties. And now I basically use those objects that I've created that were just standard data JSON contract serializer objects in .NET, which allow me to pretty easily serialize JSON blobs. And I set all the right properties. I set the name of the actor to the user with their display name. I set the email address based on their email that I've retrieved. Based on the type of event, I say whether an item was added or updated or deleted. And then I set the URL to the document, I set the actual title of the document, and I set the type to document. You could actually go way more sophisticated here. One of the things I didn't get to was actually embedding better images so that you actually see a better preview. You can do a lot more things like that, and of course, when you're implementing your own system, those are things you'd want to take advantage of. So after all that, I had a little bit of debug code here that if it failed, it would actually post a message, which is my little cheesy developer tip. And then it'll actually go post this activity into Yammer, and that basically sends that request over to Yammer with an OAuth token embedded upon it. So that's just a very basic overview of how I actually use some server-side code to go post an activity and Open Graph story into Yammer. And then, of course, this all integrates together. So as I'm posting these activity stories, that makes for a more rich Open Graph object view that I can have. So when I actually go look at that document, I see the discussions about the document. I can see activities about it as well over time, so that kind of thing. So by building all this richness around Open Graph activities that are happening inside of Yammer, you're really using Yammer as a way to sort of spread all the things that happen inside of your applications throughout organizations and across the world, really. One other tip as you're working with Open Graph activities that I think stumps every new developer who does them, which is Yammer has an algorithm which says don't show Open Graph activities until there's like a drumbeat of activities in the system. So it won't show you any Open Graph activities until there's about 10 in the site. So the first time you write this code, you'll think it's all correct, and you'll see that there's no Open Graph activity on the Yammer site. Just hit that button 10 times or 20 times just to make sure that you're actually properly feeding it. So we should probably change that so that it's a little bit more easy, but that's just one sort of pro tip as you get started with Open Graph is that there has to be at least 10 Open Graph activities registered in the system before you'll actually see the ticker on the right-hand side. So something to keep an eye out for. Just one last demo. This is actually a demo of what not to do. So probably the world's worst idea is to say, here's something that looks maybe a little bit interesting, but it's not what you should do. So I'll go show that to you. So this is a separate application that I have that's a SharePoint app called Teamboard. Now, Teamboard is an app that has its own web server that integrates with SharePoint, and what it does is it tries to show a little bit of a nicer preview of things that are inside of your SharePoint site in a more metro, tiley type of interface. It's it's kind of the rage, I guess, but you can go and sort of do things in that way. But the other thing I wanted to do was actually go and integrate Yammer into it as well. And so what I did, and what you'll see, is that I actually have a Yammer feed integrated into the site. Now, the cool thing about this demo, and let's go try this again. Let's try that one more time. There we go. So one of the other cool things about this particular application, I actually implemented it all in ScriptSharp. So ScriptSharp is just a technology for writing JavaScript in C#, which there's lots of debate about whether you should be actually writing JavaScript in some other language rather than the native, and I'm sure a lot of you have opinions on it. But for me personally, I kind of like using C# and some of the semantics it has. So I wrote all this application in. It's primarily just JavaScript that goes and calls, that calls into Yammer. So again, this is sort of a metro-style type of thing where I can actually go drill into documents. I can drill into various bits and pieces, and I can scroll through and sort of look at them. But the one thing that it does have, and this is sort of the what not to do, is it actually has sort of a Yammer feed on the side. And this is a test post like that, and I can actually go post into Yammer. Now, why should you not do this? Well, this is missing a lot of the richness that the Yammer embed feed has. It doesn't have things like auto-updating as other people post in the system. It doesn't have likes and replies and all that kind of thing. So it's, maybe there's some scenarios where we want a simplified presentation of how Yammer feeds work for like some display-only tool or something like that, where this can be justified. But if you actually want an embed, go get an embed and embed it into your site. Because it's just really difficult to sort of keep up with all the different cool things that the Yammer folks are building on top of their feed. So, this is something where if I actually wanted to make it approach the fidelity of Yammer, you'd actually go do a lot of implementation on top of it. It's not impossible, but it's something where if you can actually get away with using an embed feed and maybe messing with the CSS to get the right look and feel, that's probably a much more preferable approach to integrating with Yammer over trying to build it yourself. This is sort of the result of my kind of mentality of like, oh, let's go against the APIs and go get the data and go do cool things with it, but it turns out to be a really big sort of implementation challenge. But just to go show you what this looks like anyway, like, it's script sharp so that it's actually implemented as a bunch of different C# files that actually compile into JavaScript. If you haven't seen it yet, it's definitely something that's something you should check out. What to show you? So the main thing really I just wanted to show you was that there's just a bunch of JavaScript here that, again, when this is JavaScript code that gets embedded by the actual it gets generated by the script sharp compiler. And let's see, message poster. And message list. Okay, so you can see things like message list here, and basically what it does is it will go, make some various Yammer calls to go grab various messages, pull them in, and then build JavaScript objects to go sort of render them into the page. And so this is just another sample that will be part of it. You can take a look at it as well, but stylistically, again, just to reiterate, like, use Yammer embeds wherever possible, and keep in mind that Yammer's a constantly moving target in terms of adding new features, adding new capabilities. So where you can actually use the pre-baked components is always a good idea. So interesting about the things you can do, very flexible and easy to work with, except for when it comes to actually trying to replicate some of the richness that Yammer has. So that's it. Okay.
Okay, so everything that we just showed, those are all APIs that you can hit, things that you can do in a free Yammer network with no approval process by us, and it's all possible for cloud apps, if your app is a cloud app or an on-premise app. So now we're getting into a slide where, or starting to get into an area where you would need a premium network. So before I get into that, so what we just showed mostly were user-enabled apps. So a user comes to your site or goes to our app directory, discovers your product, and wants to, and then has to connect it to their Yammer account in order for them to have all the Yammer social experiences inside of your app and see all the app data inside of Yammer, or send all the app data to Yammer. So that's what we call a user-enabled app. Users can do it one by one. They don't need the approval of their Yammer admins or their IT staff in order to install a user-enabled app. And a good example of a user-enabled app is an app called Skidoo, which we developed and open-sourced to be an example app of how to create user-enabled apps on the Yammer platform. But another type of app is an admin-enabled app. So this is what the Microsoft Dynamics team is working on, and there are a lot of use cases where an admin-enabled app is more appropriate than a user-enabled app. For example, when the Dynamics, so when you want to connect Dynamics with Yammer, an admin of Microsoft Dynamics CRM has to go into Dynamics, connect using their token. They need to be an admin in Yammer as well. So it's a little bit more of a hassle to get installed, but once an admin connects an admin-enabled app, their token can be used to impersonate all the users. So now the users of that Dynamics CRM don't need to click a sign in with Yammer button. The admin can just be or the system is monitoring what they're doing, and then the system is using the admin's permissions to send stories on behalf of those users. So yeah, you can see that there are use cases, or different use cases that would be appropriate for user and admin. My rule of thumb is if your app is freemium and you want it to be viral, then you should do a user-enabled app, because then users don't need the permission of their admins in order to use the integration. And if you have more of a classic business application, and you're selling to IT potentially, then you can say, okay, you will have the rights to install this and connect it to Yammer, and that's where you kind of maybe build in that flexibility to impersonate users into your app. So those are the two options. So that shows that the admin authenticates and all the users don't have to authenticate anymore in order for us to get activity stories, or for them to see Yammer embed, or in order for you to hit the REST API on behalf of Yammer users. Okay, so developing a global Yammer app. So I mentioned that everything other than the admin-enabled app idea is possible for you right now inside of free networks without any kind of upgrading or admins necessary to get going. But when you register an app, like you saw Mike do at the top of the demo, you are creating what we call a local Yammer app. So that app is only going to work, it's only going to be authorizable on the network that you, the developer, are in, and any network that you join. So the use case of developing a local app and never making it global is you're doing some consulting for a customer, or maybe you're on the IT team of a company, and you are creating an app that's really only for that company. You don't need users from different Yammer networks to be able to install and discover your app, because it's just something that's specific for that individual Yammer network. So if that's your app, if that describes your app, then you're done. You don't ever need to get any kind of approval from us. You can even list your app in the app directory of that one network that you're in. But if you are developing an app, like probably most of you are, that you want multiple users in different networks to be able to install and discover and interact with and learn about in Yammer, then you need it to be a global app. So that is an approval process that you go through with us. We have a partner, our business development team, that will look at the functionality of your app and make sure that you're not spamming the feed, and also make sure that if you're storing access tokens, like an admin's access token or user's access tokens, that you're doing it securely. So it's a pretty quick review process, but at the end of it, you get to be listed in the app directory of every user can get to in every network, and then any user can install your app. So this just describes the steps, and those 3 steps on the right are only required if you're developing a global app. Okay.
All right, so I think we showed you a little bit of all the various demos and various components of integrating with Yammer with Office and Yammer with SharePoint, and being able to sort of see how you can integrate with it. So hopefully this has stoked your inspiration and sort of your desire to go do sort of more things that integrate Yammer and SharePoint. If you just want to go show one final thing.
Okay, yeah. So one final API that we didn't talk about, and I figured I should mention, is there is a data export API. So if you're developing an app that is designed for, say, adding Yammer data to a data retention tool, or if you're doing content monitoring or something like that, something where you would just need a big dump of a bunch of data in order to analyze. You could be making a Yammer analytics app. Some of those already exist. Then you're not going to want to use the REST API, because the REST API pages messages by 20, so you're going to have to page through all the messages and then get the files separately. So that's kind of a hassle. And we made the data export API. This one does require an admin token to use, and it basically just exports a whole bunch of messages and a zipped up file a zip file of all the files in Yammer. What you do specify is a time range, so that you can kind of get a handleable amount of data from the API. So we don't have an example of that one, but it is documented. Here, just in case you want to download this deck later, there's some resources. We have developer documentation, which you saw Mike use, and then there's also something called the Yammer Developer Network. So there are several thousand developers in there now collaborating and talking about APIs and talking about what they're doing with Yammer. So you can get ideas from them, you can get support from them and us for developing Yammer apps inside the YDN, and I encourage you to join.
So please fill out your session evaluations as well. That'll help us sort of improve, and so we really appreciate that. We'll take a look at that and work to improve our future decks. And then finally,
all right.
Just one side note: we're not wearing these mustaches for fun. So if you're looking to donate towards prostate cancer, you can also contribute to our Movember page as well. But anyway, if you have questions about Yammer, happy to take them. We're a bit over time, so apologize for that. So we can take a few, but happy to take some.
If you're authenticating with the ADFS 2.0, doing a single sign-on, does that change anything of what you've talked about with with OAuth tokens?
It doesn't really change anything with the OAuth tokens. Yammer networks can be set up with SAML-based single sign-on using any SAML server like ADFS. We have probably a small percentage of our customers are on SSO and using their own ADFS boxes or one of the other vendors. It doesn't really affect anything that we talked about today, other than, in order to connect an app to your Yammer account, you have to be signed into Yammer, obviously, so Yammer knows who to connect that app to. And the sign-in process is different for an SSO-enabled network. So, yeah, if you have a customer or you are an SSO-enabled network already in Yammer, you're already familiar with the flow. And, yeah, you get all that for free as a developer.
Okay, thanks.
Question?
I see some potential in improving people search through all these discussions and items that's been made in Yammer. Is there any way to configure a search scope into Yammer, or would you have to export data to do that?
So it was kind of hard to hear you. I think the question was around how the search API endpoints work and whether the search can be scoped to like users instead of everything. So yeah, the answer is yes. There's a couple of search endpoints to know about. One of them is just the regular search endpoint, so that's what you get if you just pass it a keyword and then it gives you results. So that's the simple one. Then there's autocomplete, which is more exciting. You pass a piece of a string and then it can, depending on how you architect it from your side, in real time deliver suggested results that are ranked by relevance. So it's what we use to power our type ahead universal search bar at the top of each Yammer network. And yeah, that's usually a better way to go for search in Yammer. And I know that one can be scoped, but I'm not sure actually off the top of my head if the regular search API can be scoped or not, or if it can't, you just get a whole bunch of data and then you parse it out. It's sectioned into different types of data like users, groups, topics, etc.
For the Yammer developer site, what are the plans around having debug versions of Yammer.js? Because right now it's kind of frustrating to always come up against walls of things that you know that Yammer can do, but that function just isn't documented. And having to reverse engineer Yammer.js just to find out the name of that one little function that you actually need.
Yeah, so we recently released a new version of the developer doc site. I don't know if you have been on it yet. So it has a couple more endpoints, but now that we have the new version out, we're going to be trying to open up more endpoints. So.
Okay, but what about having it so there's at least like a debug version of the Yammer.js so you can go and look at it if it's not there documented on the site already?
So, yeah. I mean,
one of the things that I've done is I've actually taken a download of yam.js and actually I put it into Visual Studio, and you do the edit advanced document outline, and that will sort of expand it and de-crunch it, I guess.
Deminify, yeah.
Yeah, so that helps. I mean, that's not as good as having like maybe all the variables expanded and that kind of thing, but that's one tool. I think the other thing is that there's definitely a move to sort of document more APIs. I think there's some undocumented stuff that is undocumented by design, which of course is buyer beware, I think. But yeah.
So it just seems like instead of waiting another year for additional documentation, because until the recent refresh, the developer site hadn't been touched since the beta of embed. So
I think, it's easy for me to say now, but I think there is definitely more of a commitment and more manpower, if you will, to actually keep the site up to date. We've been talking about it quite a bit. I know it's easy for me to say like, oh, but it'll be different. Trust us. I know it's easy to say now, but we will be working on that, and we will be sort of having a more updated cadence. And things like this code. Sorry again, I apologize for not getting this on the slide earlier. I'll have the code up this weekend. You can either email me at mikeam@microsoft.com or on my website, amerlon.us/mike. We'll have the code up there, so this will hopefully be a good resource if you're a .NET developer and do more to document that. And yeah, we will try to come back and not let the site go for a long time without sort of substantive updates, for sure.
Thanks.
Can you clarify at all about groups, Yammer groups? Because it seemed like it was very fuzzy to me. What group am I talking? If I put my embed into my app, and then in my app I'm sending a message, which group did it go to?
Mm-hmm. Okay,
and I often want to say this app, or maybe because I'm starting a link with the new app, this app, there should be a group dedicated to this page, or my object should have a group.
So yeah, a couple things in there. Yeah, we didn't focus very much on groups. Just, I don't know, we just focused on other things. So groups are a big concept in Yammer. It's something that we, in the core product, have spent a lot of time pushing and optimizing, and we added counters, and it's one of the most frequently iterated on and tested on pieces of the Yammer core app. Yeah, so all the endpoints for groups are exposed. You can get all the groups that a user belongs to and all the groups in the entire network, or some of them are secure or like private and unlisted, and so some users can get access to those and others can't based on admin status, that sort of thing. You can post to groups if you're implementing posting directly to Yammer from inside your app. You can do a Yammer embed group feed depending on. So one of our.
That's what I wanted.
Yeah. So yeah,
I wanted to embed a group.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I just didn't know how do I know what group.
So there's parameters for
Yeah,
sort of
it's just a parameter.
embedding, to specify which group you want to embed. There's parameters for when you actually post to sort of target it at a particular group. And the other thing is when you actually do the Open Graph embed, which I did for that document story stuff, that one ends up getting targeted at sort of your followers, but there's a sort of a picker where you can actually choose which group to go post those into as well for Open Graph activities.
Okay, I thought they.
Probably should. We'll take more questions off stage, and otherwise, thanks a lot.